Good morning, everyone. Today, we will be learning about a school of thought that greatly opposed the idea about the mind as a compartmentalized force, which was the view of a former school of thought called structuralism. Our current discussion in functionalism will help us understand how this American school of thought drove early psychology as an applied and practical science rather than a pure science. Functionalism was never a well-defined school of thought. It had no recognized leader or singular methodology. But amidst its diversity, common themes ran through this school of thought. And today, we will be discussing the characteristics of functionalism. Functionalists opposed what they considered the sterile search for the elements of consciousness in which the structuralists engaged. They did not believe that there are several compartments or elements responsible for various behavioral expressions, such as sensations, images, and affect, ideas proposed by structuralists. Functionalists believe that mental processes have a function which is to aid the organism to adapt to the environment. They were interested in the is for or the function rather than the is or structure. Functionalists wanted psychology to be a practical science, not a pure science, and they sought to apply their findings to the improvement of personal life, education, industry, and so on. Functionalists urged the broadening of psychology to include research on animals, children, and abnormal humans. They also accepted eclectic methodology, from mazes to mental tests. Because functionalists were interested with the why of mental processes and behavior, they also focused on motivation. As organisms tend to act differently in the same environment in order to adapt, their needs must be understood first before the organism's behavior can be interpreted accordingly. Functionalists accepted mental processes and behavior as legitimate subject matters for psychology, and most of them viewed introspection as one of the many valid research tools. Functionalists were more interested with what made organisms different from one another than what made them similar. And lastly, all functionalists were directly or indirectly influenced by the ideas of William James. Before we review the thoughts of some members of the school of functionalism, we must highly consider the foundation provided by William James. William James represented the transition from European psychology to US psychology. He did not intend to create a school of thought, but his ideas contained the seeds of functionalism. He was referred as the psychological pope of the New World, as Wilhelm Wundt was the psychological pope of the Old World. In 1872, he taught courses in Harvard University combining physiology and psychology. He created a small demonstration laboratory in 1875. This created a controversy as to who gets credit for establishing psychology's first laboratory. But this was given to Wundt as his laboratory was more elaborate and was designed for research instead of merely for teaching demonstrations. In 1878, James was contracted by publisher Henry Holt to write a textbook on psychology, published 12 years later in 1890. James was not proud of the work, The Principles of Psychology. He mocked this book for two reasons. First, because James believed that there is no such thing as the science of psychology, and second, because he believed he was incapable of writing a book in psychology. First appearing as 2 volumes with 28 chapters and a total of 1,393 pages, William James published a condensed version of it 2 years after, which he called the Briefer Course. The Briefer Course came to be called Jimmy, as the larger Principles was called James. It contained treatment of a diverse array of topics, many of which later researchers pursued. Almost everything in Principles can be seen as a critical evaluation or attack of what Wilhelm Wundt's approach to psychology was. However, this was an attack against Wundt, the experimentalist. If he had delved deeper into Wundt's voluntarism and later Volkspsychologie, he would have seen a remarkable similarity between himself and Wundt. With his concept of stream of consciousness, James opposed those who were busy searching for the elements of thought. In the first place, according to James, consciousness is personal. It reflects the experiences of an individual, and therefore it is foolish to search for elements common to all minds. Second, consciousness is continuous and cannot be divided up for analysis. Third, consciousness is ever-changing. Even though consciousness is continuous and can be characterized as a stream from birth to death, it is also constantly changing like that of a very long river. Therefore, one can never have the same idea twice because consciousness is ever-changing. Last and most importantly, consciousness is functional. This idea permeates to all of James' writings, and this is the point from which the school of functionalism developed. The purpose of consciousness is to aid the individual in adapting to the environment, and this is the idea that elementalists overlooked. Here, we also see the influence of Darwin on early US psychology. This context of consciousness is what ultimately separates Wilhelm Wundt and other structuralists to William James and functionalism. James believed that much of animal and human behavior is governed by instinct. James did not believe, however, that instincts are blind and invariable. Such behaviors are modifiable by experience. As a person grows, new instinct-like patterns of behavior develop, which James called habits. Habits are formed as an activity is repeated. Next is his idea of the self, or the empirical self. He called this the me in personality, which consists of everything that a person could call his or her own. This me-self not only refers to his body and his psychic powers, but also his clothes, his house, his wife and his children, his friends and ancestors, his reputation and work, his lands and horses, and his yachts and bank accounts. He divided the self into three: the material self, which contains every material thing that a person could call his or her own. Next, we have the social self, or the self as known by others, and the spiritual self, a person's states of consciousness. It is everything that we think, which includes emotions associated with our various states of consciousness. The spiritual self, then, has to do with the experience of one's subjective reality. The I self. As the me self is the person as known by himself or herself, the I self is the aspect that does the knowing. The I self is like older philosophical and theological notions such as the soul, spirit, and transcendental ego. William James was among the first to examine the circumstances under which people feel good or bad about themselves. He concluded that a person's self-esteem is determined by the ratio of things attempted to things achieved, which is represented by the formula self-esteem is equal to success over pretensions. It should be noted that, according to James, one can increase self-esteem by succeeding more or attempting less. James reversed the traditional belief that emotions result from our perception of an event. For example, it was traditionally believed that if we see an angry dog, we are frightened and then we run. However, according to James, if we see an angry dog, we run and then we are frightened. Perception, according to James, causes bodily reactions that are then experienced as emotions. In other words, the emotions we feel depend on what we do. In his words, we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful. His theory of emotion yields practical advice. Act the way you want to feel. Danish physician Carl George Lang provided a very similar theory at about the same time. Hence, this theory became known as the James-Lang theory of emotions. Although the assumption of determinism or predictability of outcomes is what makes science, including psychology, possible, for certain approaches to the study of humans, the assumption of free will might be very helpful. To support James's idea of free will, he had this ideomotor theory of behavior, where an idea of a certain action causes that action to occur. This automatic process continues unless mental effort stops or holds the impending action. For James, voluntary action and mental effort were inseparable. Bodily events causes thoughts, and thoughts causes behavior. Everywhere in James' writings is his belief in pragmatism, which is a cornerstone of functionalism. According to this, any belief thought, or behavior must be judged by its consequences. Any belief that helps create a more effective and satisfying life is worth holding, whether such a belief is scientific or religious. Believing in free will was emotionally satisfying to James, so he believed in it. Applied in psychology, James urged the use of both introspection and experimentation, as well as the study of animals, children, pre-literate humans, and abnormal humans. In other words, use any method that would shed light on the complexities of human existence. The next part of the report will talk about the other significant people who developed similar ideas related to functionalism.